They called him nothing more than staff, a disposable worker, a background figure in the marble halls of Beverly Hills. But that night, under the rage of thunder and the cut of lightning across the skull, Adrian Frost would be forced to choose between silence and sacrifice. The choice would leave him bleeding on polished stone floors, cast out into the storm, and branded by lies that spread faster than the rain. What no one knew was that the same storm would one day lift his name into history. The Carter mansion pulsed with wealth, towering chandeliers, silk curtains trembling in the wind that forced its way through cracked windows, marble floors reflecting the violent glow of the sky outside. In that world of excess, Adrian did not belong. He was 25, a young man with clean features, pale skin that flushed easily, a body shaped by long hours of physical work in hospitals, not gyms. A small LGBT pride pin clung to his shirt pocket, a quiet declaration he had never hidden even when it cost him jobs. For years he had worked double shifts, cleaning wounds, pushing wheelchairs, feeding patients who could no longer lift a spoon. He had been hired here only weeks earlier, assigned to care for Henry Carter, a 76-year-old veteran whose strength had withered but whose pride still lived in every sharp look. Adrian had grown used to moving silently through the house, hearing the servants whisper about his sexuality, hearing their laughter when they thought he was out of earshot. Still, he carried trays, checked pulses, and wrote notes in neat handwriting that few bothered to read. The job was not dignity, but it was survival. Until the night Elaine Carter unleashed her fury. Elaine swept into the hall, her voice sharp enough to split glass. She was tall, her gown clinging like a blade of silk, her diamonds catching every strike of lightning. In her eyes burned contempt, not only for her father-in-law, but for the young man who dared to stand between them. Henry trembled in his chair, his skin thin and pale, his breath shallow. Adrian moved instinctively, placing his own body as a shield. His heart pounded, not from fear for himself, but from the fragile life behind him. The storm outside roared as Elaine lifted a half-full glass of wine and hurled it across the room. It struck Adrian's forearm, the glass shattering, shards carving into his flesh. Red spilled across the carpet, mingling with the spilled wine, a grotesque painting of devotion and violence. Adrian clenched his jaw, refusing to move. His body trembled, but his stance never broke. Henry whispered the only words he could still summon from his years of service: steady, soldier. Elaine's shrieks rose higher, her hand striking across Adrian's face, then his shoulder. Each blow landed with the weight of class and cruelty, as if wealth itself demanded his submission. His pleas were not for himself, but for Henry, begging silently that the old man be spared the chaos. The marble echoed with fury, and then the sound of footsteps entered the storm. Richard Carter, billionaire son of Henry, had returned home earlier than expected. His eyes froze as he saw his wife's hand lifted against Adrian, the young man's arms streaked with blood, his body shielding the old veteran. For a moment there was silence, broken only by the thunder. Then Elaine's voice shifted, feigning innocence, dripping with false concern. She accused Adrian of attacking Henry, of betraying the family he served. The blood, the broken glass, the trembling father, it was enough to cloud Richard's mind. Fear and shock fused into authority. His voice, deep and decisive, cut through the hall like a verdict. Adrian was dismissed. He was ordered to leave at once. The words struck harder than Elaine's blows. Adrian's knees weakened. He looked at Henry, but the old man's hand, frail and shaking, could not rise against his own son's command. With his arm pressed to his wound, Adrian stumbled to the massive front doors. They shut behind him with a hollow thud, leaving him in the rain that swallowed his tears. For the first time since he had stepped into the Carter estate, he was no longer staff. He was nothing. His only crime was standing between cruelty and a dying man. His only reward was exile into a storm that mirrored the betrayal inside. The mansion lights glowed behind him, silhouettes moving in warmth and wealth. Ahead stretched only darkness, a road slick with water and shadows. Adrian whispered into the night, his voice trembling, his pride breaking but not destroyed. I did nothing wrong. God knows I didn't. And so began the story of the young gay man they cast out. A story that would not end in that reign, but grow into a trial of truth, loyalty, and the price of dignity. If you believe stories like Adrian's deserve to be told, don't forget to follow Heart Stories, because every voice matters, and every truth deserves its day in the light. The Carter mansion never truly slept. Even in silence, the marble seemed to hum with echoes of past grandeur. That night, long after Adrian had been cast out into the storm, Richard Carter paced alone through the great hall. The chandeliers still glittered, but their brilliance felt harsh, almost accusatory. Each step of his polished shoes sounded louder than it should have, reverberating against the emptiness left behind. He told himself he had acted to protect his father, yet unease gnawed at him. There had been blood on the floor, too much for a mere scuffle. There had been shards of crystal scattered far from where Elaine claimed the struggle began. And there had been something else, Henry's trembling hand, stretching weakly as Adrian disappeared. Richard had seen that gesture before, during his father's military ceremonies, when the salute meant pride, not fear. Tonight it had looked like a plea. Restlessness drove him into the security wing, a narrow room lined with glowing monitors. The guards stiffened when he entered, uncertainty flickering in their eyes. They had not expected him to come in person. Richard ordered the footage. The screen flickered, black and white shadows moving across polished marble. At first, only muffled shapes filled the frame. Then the storm inside the hall returned in merciless clarity. He saw Elaine's arm hurling the glass. He saw Adrian flinch but refuse to step aside. He saw the slap, the shove, the body of a young man absorbing every strike without retaliation. The truth spread across the screen with unyielding brutality. Richard's jaw tightened, his knuckles pale as he gripped the edge of the console. His wife, the woman society praised for elegance and charm, had raised her hand against both his father and the man sworn to protect him, and he had sent the wrong man away. In that moment, Richard felt something inside him fracture. He was a billionaire accustomed to power, but money could not purchase back the words he had spoken, the betrayal he had allowed. The storm outside had eased to a drizzle, yet the storm inside him raged louder than ever. At dawn, the mansion's study became the stage of reckoning. Elaine entered draped in silk, her hair immaculate, her lips painted in defiance. She carried herself as if nothing could tarnish her beauty, not even the truth. Richard stood near the tall windows, light spilling across his tailored suit. His expression, usually controlled for boardrooms and interviews, was cold, almost unfamiliar. He held a folder in one hand, legal papers prepared overnight. The confrontation was brief. He told her he had seen the footage. Her face, flawless under layers of powder, blanched then hardened into venom. She hissed threats of scandal, whispers of ruin, promises to drag his name through the same mud she had spilled on Adrian. Richard's reply was measured, almost icy. The marriage was over. The annulment would be filed by noon. Guards would escort her from the estate before sunset. Elaine's shrieks echoed down the marble corridors, but they no longer carried weight. For the first time, her voice felt small against the vastness of the house. When she was gone, silence returned, not peace, but the kind of silence that lingers after destruction, heavy and sharp. Henry Carter sat in his chair by the window, weak sunlight painting fragile outlines across his lined face. He had heard enough to understand. When Richard entered, the old man's voice was barely a whisper, yet it carried the authority of a commander. That boy, Adrian, he stood like a soldier. Do not let his sacrifice be forgotten. Richard knelt beside his father, guilt pressing into his chest like iron. His father's words left no room for denial. He had wronged the one person who had shown unshakable loyalty. There was only one path left to make it right. By evening, Richard drove through Los Angeles, rain still dampening the streets, neon lights flickering on wet asphalt. He found Adrian where the storm had left him, sitting alone in a small diner on Wilshire Boulevard. His uniform sleeve was torn, hastily wrapped with paper napkins stained dark with dried blood. He cradled a cup of coffee, steam rising to a face pale from exhaustion, eyes shadowed by betrayal, yet holding a dignity no storm could erase. Richard stopped in the doorway, the hum of the diner muffled by the pounding of his own heart. The billionaire, the man the city worshipped for power and wealth, now stood hesitant before a young caregiver who had nothing but his pride. For the first time in years, Richard felt the weight of humility. He stepped forward, ready to face the man he had cast out, ready to speak words far heavier than any contract his fortune could draft. The morning after Elaine's departure, the Carter mansion stood tall against the Los Angeles skyline, yet its walls no longer contained secrecy. News outlets swarmed like vultures, and by noon, Adrian Frost's name had spilled into headlines across the nation. His face, captured in grainy photographs from the night of the storm, became an image dissected by strangers who had never heard his voice. Articles multiplied with ruthless creativity. One paper suggested he had seduced his way into the Carter estate. A television panel debated whether he was a gold digger, each commentator layering speculation with disdain. The cruelest voices fixated on the pride pin that glimmered on his uniform. A political stunt. They sneered. Others spat out the words "gay boy" as if his identity were a weapon against him. Inside the mansion, whispers threaded through corridors. Staff who once dismissed him now eyed him with sharper suspicion. Their glances lingered too long, mouths curling in private judgment. Adrian felt it when he carried trays, when he adjusted Henry Carter's blanket, when he crossed the marble floor beneath chandeliers that seemed to magnify every breath. His steps grew heavier, each one pressed under the invisible weight of ridicule. Beyond the gates, life offered no refuge. At a grocery store, Adrian stood in line clutching simple items: milk, bread, medicine for Henry. A woman glanced at him, then leaned to whisper in her companion's ear. Both burst into laughter. "That's him," the man said loud enough for others to hear, the one chasing Carter's fortune. Heat rose in Adrian's cheeks, his grip tightening on the basket until his knuckles turned pale. He said nothing. Silence, he believed, was the only armor left. But silence did not shield the soul. Each insult carved deeper, not because of the words themselves, but because they fed a shadow already living inside him. Adrian had grown up hearing slurs muttered behind his back, feeling the sting of rejection from classmates and neighbors who considered him different. Yet this was sharper. Now the world was watching. His private identity had been dragged into the public square and twisted into scandal. At night, he sat by Henry's bedside. The old man's breaths rasped, shallow yet steady, his eyes following Adrian with quiet intensity. In those moments, Adrian felt both seen and understood. Henry rarely spoke, but when he did, the words landed with the authority of a soldier who had weathered war. "Steady, soldier," he whispered again, a frail echo of the battlefield he had once commanded. Those words became Adrian's anchor. Though the mansion groaned with judgment, though newspapers printed lies, though strangers spat cruelty, he remained at Henry's side. He bathed trembling hands, measured fragile breaths, and ignored the cameras that sometimes tried to capture his shadow through curtained windows. Richard Carter, too, felt the storm. Yet his armor was different. Wealth shielded him from the deepest wounds. He stood beside Adrian during a press conference, declaring the truth with a controlled voice. He told the world that Adrian had saved his father's life, that without him, Henry Carter would have faced cruelty unchecked. Cameras flashed, reporters pressed forward, microphones caught every syllable. And still the tide of suspicion did not vanish. Some clapped in support. Others hissed that it was a staged performance, a crafted narrative to protect the Carter fortune. Adrian, standing beside Richard, felt the tremor in his knees as hundreds of eyes bore into him. The spotlight was not a place he had ever sought, yet it found him, exposing every weakness, every doubt. When his turn came to speak, His voice cracked. He stared at the crowd, at the endless forest of lenses and faces waiting to devour his words. For a moment, he nearly faltered. Then he thought of Henry, frail but unbroken, whispering steady. He lifted his chin. "I did not stand in that hall for wealth," Adrian said slowly, each word carrying the weight of a wound. "I did not raise my body as a shield because of contracts or promises. I stood there because he deserved protection, because no one, not even the powerful, should suffer violence in their final years. That is the truth. You may choose to believe it or not, but I will not be broken by lies." Silence followed. For the first time, no one spoke. Cameras whirred, pens scratched, but the room itself seemed to hold its breath. Adrian's words hung in the air, fragile yet unshakable. And so the story shifted, just slightly. For every voice that still mocked, another began to question. For every insult hurled, a stranger whispered respect. Adrian remained under siege. Yet within the storm, a light flickered. It was faint, uncertain, but it was hope. The Carter estate had long been a fortress of wealth, its gates stretching tall and cold against the city beyond. But by the end of that week, it became something else, a stage for outrage. Crowds gathered at the iron bars, their voices rising like a tide against stone. Signs waved in angry fists. Some demanded justice for Elaine, painting her as a wronged woman. Others hurled slurs at Adrian Frost, branding him a fraud, a manipulator, a symbol of everything they despised. Day after day, the noise grew louder. Helicopters circled above, their blades cutting the sky into fragments of sound. Camera crews camped outside the perimeter, feeding a nation hungry for conflict. From within the mansion, Adrian could hear it all. The chants, the jeers, the venom disguised as opinion. Each word pressed against his chest like a weight he could not set down. Adrian moved through the house with measured calm, though inside his nerves trembled. He kept close to Henry Carter, never leaving the old man's side. Henry sat in his chair by the window, the veteran's eyes clouded, yet unflinching. He had faced worse than chance, worse than hatred, and his hand sometimes reached out to rest on Adrian's arm, a silent reminder: steady, soldier. But steady was difficult when the world rattled against the glass. That evening, the protests surged with new force. Shadows of bodies writhed beyond the gates, their voices sharper, more violent. Security tried to hold them back, yet anger has a way of slipping through cracks. Stones clattered against the walls. The sound echoed down corridors, a rain of hostility pounding harder with each minute. Adrian guided Henry to the far side of the room, drawing curtains in a futile attempt to muffle the storm. Then came the crack. A single stone, hurled with precise malice, struck the wide window pane. Glass fractured in an instant, shards bursting inward like frozen rain. The shatter roared through the hall, cutting the air with piercing clarity. Adrian did not think. His body moved before his mind caught up. He threw himself in front of Henry, arms wide, back arched to shield the frail figure behind him. Shards rained down, slicing into his skin, catching in his hair, embedding into his clothes. Pain surged, sharp and hot, but he did not flinch. He stood as the glass fell, absorbing the storm so Henry would not. The old man gasped, his weak hands grasping Adrian's sleeve as if to pull him back. Yet Adrian held firm, blood streaking down his arms, his breath ragged. Outside, the crowd howled, unaware of the wound they had inflicted or the courage they had provoked. Inside, silence fell except for the ringing in Adrian's ears and the thud of his heart. Richard arrived seconds later, drawn by the crash. He froze in the doorway, eyes locked on the sight of Adrian standing tall, body cut and bleeding, shielding his father. For a moment, time itself seemed to pause. The billionaire, accustomed to deals and empires, saw what neither money nor influence could command: devotion unpurchased, loyalty unshaken. Photographers had followed the chaos, their lenses pressed against the gaps in the gate. Flashes ignited as the scene unfolded. By dawn, the image would spread across the world, a young gay caregiver, his body scarred and bloodied, shielding a war veteran from violence. The photo would land on front pages, the caption already written by the truth itself. Later that night, Adrian sat in the quiet of the study while a doctor cleaned the cuts across his arms and shoulders. He remained still, not for his own comfort, but to keep Henry calm. The old man refused to let go of his hand. In the dim light, their silhouettes reflected against shelves lined with history and law, two figures bound not by blood but by something greater: sacrifice. When the doctor finished, Richard stood near the fireplace, silent. His usual certainty had dissolved into something humbler, almost reverent. He watched Adrian, who sat exhausted yet unbroken, his pride pin catching the faint glow of firelight. It was small, barely noticeable against torn fabric, but to Richard it seemed brighter than the flames themselves. Beyond the gates, the protest dwindled into night. The anger remained. The noise would return. But within those walls, a truth had been carved into stone. Adrian Frost did not bend. When glass shattered, when blood spilled, he stood. And though the world might still jeer, within the Carter estate, his courage had become undeniable. The ceremony was held in Washington, beneath the vaulted ceilings of a hall reserved for national honor. Rows of veterans filled the seats, uniforms pressed, medals gleaming. Families gathered with quiet reverence, children clutching flags, their eyes wide as they looked up at the stage. The air carried both pride and solemnity, a reminder that sacrifice had many forms. Adrian Frost stood at the edge of the platform, his suit modest yet sharp, a small pride pin fastened to his lapel. His cuts had healed into faint scars, but their memory lingered in the weight of his posture. He did not seek the spotlight. He had never dreamed of standing before cameras or officials. And yet here he was, summoned not by ambition, but by choices that had cost him blood. When his name was called, applause filled the hall. The sound struck his chest like a wave, foreign and overwhelming. He stepped forward, every footfall measured, his gaze steady though his heart raced. At the podium, his voice carried not the polish of rehearsed speeches, but the raw edge of truth. He told them he had stood that night because a frail man deserved protection, because dignity should not be reserved for the powerful. Then came the silence that precedes revelation. Henry Carter, seated in his wheelchair at the front, raised a trembling hand. The audience hushed as the old veteran's voice filled the hall, weak yet resolute. "This young man did more than shield me from glass and rage," Henry declared. "He reminded me what honor looks like. And for that, I have signed his name into my will. Adrian Frost is my heir, not of fortune, but of spirit, not of blood, but of courage." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Cameras flashed. Richard Carter stood tall behind his father, his face softened with pride. Adrian's eyes blurred, tears rising unbidden as the truth spread through the room. He had not only defended Henry, he had been chosen as family. Adrian bowed his head, whispering through the roar of applause, "I will not break. Not because I need wealth, but because I have found where I belong." The image of that moment would echo beyond the hall, a story retold not in gossip, but in gratitude. The boy cast out in the storm had become a man embraced by legacy. And now I want to ask you, what would you have done if the world mocked you? Yet an old man's life rested in your hands. Would you have stood your ground? No matter the kind, if this story touched you, follow Heart Stories. Because here we believe every act of courage deserves to be remembered.